Hi, in this video we will talk about constraint layout. Since there's a lot to cover in constraint layout, I'll split this video in two parts. In this part, I'll explain some basic elements of constraint layout, and in the next one, I will touch some of the advanced topics in constraint layout, and we will design a layout together as well. So constraint layout is specifically designed to keep the view hierarchy flat. The problem with layouts we discussed in the previous videos is that they result in a lot of nesting if you are designing a very complex layout, and the nested layouts affect the performance of the Android application. And they also obviously make the layout much more complicated to handle as well, so you should try to keep the view hierarchy flat. And in order to alleviate that problem, Android team came up with constraint layout. Using constraint layout, we can define complex set of constraints between elements in a layout, which helps to keep the view hierarchy flat. So let's see how it works. So here we have my layout file open already. The first thing we need is the constraint layout itself. So now you can go here to the code and add it here directly as well. I have a linear layout right now, but another easy way to do that is that in the design view, if you go to the component tree, you can see I have one linear layout here. If you right click here, there should be an option to say convert whatever layout you have to constraint layout. And if you select that, it will give you a warning that it will try to create, it will flatten up your hierarchy and it will try to create some constraints by itself. But since we don't really have anything in the linear layout, it doesn't really matter. Press OK. And now this will be converted to constraint layout. And it still says linear layout. I think it's because it has this ID. So by default, it shows the ID. So for now, we can remove this ID, go back to design, and then we can see here that we have a constraint layout over here. Now in the previous videos, I said that it's better to use the code to design the layout. Now when it comes to constraint layout, it can be a bit too difficult to start working with constraint layout if you start coding in it, because it has a comparatively pretty complex set of constraints that you need to write. So for constraint layout, I would suggest to start with the layout editor. And actually the layout editor is designed to work with constraint layout pretty seamlessly. So it's very optimized for constraint layout. So let's see how it works. So to start with, I will drag a button on the screen. Now, first thing that you will notice is that unlike in the previous layouts, the button just dropped here. It didn't go to the top left corner, because by default, if you don't define anything, if you don't define the position of the view, it appears in the top left corner. Now this is just done to make the constraint layout easy to use, to define the constraints of a view more easily. Now if you run this application, we haven't defined any constraints on this button. It will still appear in the top left corner. I will not run the application, but if you're curious, you can pause this video and run the application to see that it indeed appears on the top left corner. So another thing that you will notice here is that it has certain circles around it. Now these are used to define the constraint on each side of the button. So for each side of the view you can define the constraint. And then also we have something here. Now all of these elements, these circles and these squares, are called handles. So we have handles on all sides to define the constraint of this view. And we also have handles. Basically these handles are used to adjust the size of the view. So you can click here and start dragging it and change the size of the view as well. And you can do it from any corner. So now we have increased the size of the button. So let's define some constraints here. So if we, let's say we want this button to appear in the top right corner. So then we will define one constraint at the top. So we can say that the top of this button should be at the top of the layout. And then we can take this and say that, okay, we want the right side of this button to be on the right of the layout. And there we have it. We have the button on the top right corner of the screen. Now another thing, I will drag it back, I will delete the constraint. Now in order to delete the constraint, you basically select it and press the delete button. So I will delete both of the constraints now. Now one thing that you will notice here is that Android Studio gives us a warning. If I click here, it says missing constraints in constraint layout. The view is not constrained. So this is just an Android Studio's way of telling us that, hey, we haven't defined any constraints for this button. And if you run the application, it will still work. And this is just a warning. It's just trying to tell you that, hey, we haven't defined the constraints, and this will not appear in the final layout as you want it to be, because in this case we don't have any constraints and it will appear in the top left corner. And every view should have one vertical and one horizontal constraint. So let's say if I say that, hey, I want this button to be the left side to be on the left edge of the screen. So we have defined one horizontal constraint, but we don't have any vertical constraint. So there's no way for the Android system to know where to place it. It knows that we should place it on the left edge of the screen, but it doesn't know if we should place it here, here, down here, or where. And in order to do that, you can see that there's still warning here. In order to do that, we have to define one vertical constraint here as well. So let's say I can define it to be at the bottom. So now it is at the bottom. Now, one other thing you will notice is that all the properties for this view that I have selected are here. Now, one other thing in the constraint layout is this constraint widget over here. And this basically shows our view. And here you will see certain things that we have defined these two constraints, and it shows some view over here. And this basically shows the margin that you want to have for that constraint. So we have defined this left constraint over here, and it has a margin of 8 right now, and you can change it. So let's say if we give a bigger value, let's say 32, you can see that the button has moved here, and it shows 32 over here as well. Similarly, you can define a margin for here, 32. So every time you add a constraint, you can define the margin here as well. These constraints are not defined, but we can do that. So let's say we can add a constraint from here as well. So it says create right constraint. And if we click here, then it has created a constraint with the right edge as well. And by default, it has given this margin, which is quite a lot. So let's set it to 0, and then we can see that it's here. And similarly, you can define a constraint over here as well. Now, inside this square, you will see these lines. Now, right now it shows straight lines, which means that it has a fixed width, and that width you can see over here as well. And it's the same for the height as well. The Android Studio, for some reason, decided to give it fixed height and width. You can change that by clicking on it. So if you click on it once, it changes it to these squiggly lines. And these squiggly lines these squiggly lines means that we are basically expanding it. This is match parent. So in this case, because we have defined the constraints on both sides, it has decided to give it a 0 dp. So these squiggly lines means that it's match parent. And then if you click it again, then it goes to wrap content. So now this means that it will take as much space as it wants. Now let's delete this button for now, and let's drag a new button here. And I can show you how to center the button in the screen. So for that, we need to define both the constraints for top and bottom, and then we also have to define the constraints on the right and the left. Now you may have noticed that whenever you define constraints on either side, on both sides of the view, the lines change into these squiggly lines. This basically shows that there are opposite forces on this button right now. Now by default, those opposite forces are equal, and the button will be centered between these two constraints. And this is something that you can change as well. There are two ways basically to change that. You can either take the button, let's say you want the button to be a bit up, not exactly in the center. So you can take the button, move it up, and then it will be here. So basically what it has changed is the bias of the constraint. So here you can see, you can adjust it from here as well. So here you can see that it's not exactly in the center. It's basically 40% from the top, and you can basically change this slider up and down to change the position of the button as well. And the same for the horizontal constraint as well. So you can take that and you can adjust the bias of the constraint as well if you don't want it to be exactly in the middle. So now it just shows that like the force on this side is a bit stronger than on this side. So this is how you define the constraints on a view with respect to the parents. Now obviously, like other layouts, you can define constraints between the views in a layout as well. And for that, let me just delete this. I will drag 2 new buttons. So this one and then this one. Now let's say we want this button to be on the left of this. So basically I will drag the left edge of this button and I will put it here. So now I have defined a constraint that, hey, the left side of this button should always be on the right side of this button. But you can see that it's still not on the right here because we haven't defined any vertical constraint on it. Now, no matter where this goes, this will stay on the left. So this will stay on the right. So if I, let's say, move here, it always stays on the right side. But if I move it up and down, it doesn't really affect that one because there's no constraint for that there. So let's say we want to constrain the top of these buttons as well. So we want these buttons to be side by side. For that, we will take the top constraint of this button and we define the top constraint on this one. And now you can see that they are aligned. So the top of this button is constrained to be on the top of this. And there's a bit of a margin in this constraint. That's why they are not exactly aligned. So I will remove this. And now you can see that they're completely aligned. Now if this button moves around, the other button goes with it as well. Now this is how, this is how you define the constraints between 2 buttons. And you can define the constraints on either side as well. So let's say, let me delete these 2 again. It's easier to drag newer ones. So let's say you want this button to be below this button. So we can say that, okay, we want the left edge of this button to be on the left edge of this one. And then the right one to be here. And then the top one here. So it's exactly below. And then if you want to give some margin, you can obviously say that, okay, on the top constraint, I want to have like 32 dB of margin. And now if this goes around the button, both buttons will stick together. Now one other thing, let me remove all the constraints here. Actually, let me just delete these. This last thing for this video that I want to show you is that so far we have constrained the sides of the button to other sides of the button. Now you can also define the baseline. In some cases, it's not very suitable to define constraints between the sides of the button. So let's say this button has a bit bigger size. And we want to say that, yeah, okay, we want this button to be on the left here. And let's give it some margin so it doesn't appear that close. Oh, no, not at the top. Okay, I've given margin to the wrong constraint. So on the left one, yes, here. So even if the tops are aligned, we usually don't really want the view to be like this. We want the buttons, these baselines, these texts to be aligned. Now in order to do that, you can go here. Let me just delete these constraints. So select the constraint, press delete button. And let's just keep this. And then, so we right click it and we select show baseline. And then you will see this view for the baseline. And now in order to create a constraint on the baseline, you basically select this and you will see the baseline for the other button as well. Drag it there, release it, and now you will see that the baseline for both the buttons are aligned. We haven't aligned the top or the bottom, but we have aligned the baselines. So this is how you work. This is a very basic overview of the constraint layout. So we have learned how we can define the sizes of the views and how we can constrain the views with respect to the parent and with respect to each other. In the next video, we will see some more complicated and complex uses of the constraint layout. See you in the next video.